Hello, BookTube. Last week, Eric Karl Anderson, one of the princes of BookTube, one of our very best BookTubers, made a video called "How Do I Read So Much?" And I thought for Vlogmas Day 13, I would do a video response to his, because it got me thinking a lot. Eric used the title of his video, a question that he gets asked all the time, because long before he was one of the best BookTubers, he was also one of the best book bloggers. The Lonesome Reader was a book blog long before it was a YouTube channel, and was spectacular. Got all sorts of notice, blurbs everywhere. And when you're in that position, I of course have been in that position for a long time myself. When you're in that position, very publicly, what Jennifer at Insert Literary Pun here and Olive at A Book Olive refer to as reading publicly, when you're in that position, you get asked a lot, how do you read so much? I've been asked that question countless times, and Eric obviously has too. And he made a video that starts off with what felt like a personal dig at me, even though it wasn't meant that way at all. But there was a quote at the beginning of his video that I want to read to you, because I immediately thought of myself, and if you watch his video, you might immediately think of me as well. The quote was, "No matter how much we may love the act of reading, nobody would want to spend literally all of their time reading." And I do occasionally stop. I walk my dog. Occasionally I put on pants and go out into the real world. I do spend most of my time reading, but not maybe literally all of it. But he starts off his video also with a classic Eric maneuver. He is one of those deep readers that you hear about. You won't encounter that on this channel, but he's been doing it for a long time. And he immediately broadens the question of how do you read so much by saying that it might be in some ways more interesting to ask, why do you read so much? And his video has sort of a foot planted in both of those questions. And he starts off with broader, deeper, more big picture answers to the question, how do you read so much? And the very first one he names is a word, a 21st century concept that I have my issues with, but he, thankfully, didn't mean it in the stupid 21st century way, and that word is privilege. Of course, the word privilege has been transformed in the 21st century into a cudgel, a hashtag, a way for millennial idiots to bludgeon their betters for a crime they're not guilty of and can't ever expunge. I have no patience with that trendy definition of privilege. Miss Saint Ma lived well into her middle age, still seeing signs everywhere in the metropolitan northeast of the United States of America that said no Irish need apply. So I have no patience with pampered young people telling me that I have all sorts of privilege that I have to check. But in the way I think Eric meant it, in the real sense of the word, there's a tremendous validity to that, and it's something that we should all remember. We are all children of incredible privilege. If you are watching this video, then you have access to more privilege than has attached itself to easily 95% of all humans who have ever existed on this earth. You have access to clean power in abundant supply for a nominal amount of money. You have access to shelter. You were born into a literate culture. You yourself are not a slave. That those distinctions might seem obvious to you now, but they don't apply to most of the people who've been alive. You were born into the kind of privilege that makes a reading life possible, that makes reading as a hobby, a pastime, possible. You're not forced to work in the fields all day long with your 10 brothers and sisters. Where the very idea of spending an hour or 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day reading would be unthinkable. You would never, even in the course of the 45 years you lived until you finally died on your feet in the sun, you would never literally even think of that idea. So privilege is not a wrong thing to think of here. One of the ways that we all read so much is that we are children of privilege. But Eric also mentioned a byproduct of the fact that he was blogging on the Lonesome Reader. It's a fantastic blog. I'll leave a link to it down below, in addition to linking to his channel. One of the byproducts of being in the spotlight like that, noticing new releases in a critical way, in a way that other people talk about, in a way that obviously isn't bought and that obviously isn't derivative, is that the publishing world starts to notice that, and you start to get on publicity lists. You start to get books in the mail. That's another way that you can read so much, is that it's not it becomes a little bit less of a financial strain because books are expensive. Secondhand books are not so expensive, but they're also not as readily available. It's a definite way to read so much, to have the publishing world meet you a part of the way, or in my case, 100% of the way. They don't just meet me halfway. They supply all of my bookish needs. He mentions one of the byproducts of being on so many publicity lists, and I couldn't help but nod when I was hearing it, because I feel like it's my perspective exactly. He says, in some ways it feels ironic to me that people ask me how I read so much, because in my mind all I see is the huge stack of books I haven't got to read yet. And that's entirely true. He mentions that constantly being on the cusp of what's new and what's forthcoming is very exciting. It creates a momentum of its own that keeps you going, that keeps you very much motivated in a way that that perhaps just a random wanderer in the library backstacks, especially not a particularly good library, might occasionally not feel. There's a feeling of an ongoing conversation, is how I always refer to it, that is very real when you start to have a shelf of books that you haven't read yet, that have been sent to you, not for any obligation, but just for your consideration. That starts to shift your view. I always feel exactly the same way when somebody asks me, how do you read so much? The first thought that crosses my mind, I never say it because I don't want to feel like I'm coming off as a snot. Eric didn't, but it's my luck that I would. My first thought is, oh my God, you should see how much I haven't read. How much is coming? Just a deluge of books that's coming, or that's already on my month-by-month forthcoming shelves that I haven't touched yet. So it doesn't feel that way, even though you start to develop a track record. When Eric actually did get into any kind of nitty-gritty about answering the actual question of his video, how do I read so much, he mentioned something that was really important, something that I think a lot of people who want to read more don't take into sufficient account. And that is that he has designed his life around doing large amounts of reading. He's designed it that way. He has no dependents, no children. He has he has accustomed the people in his world to expect that large chunks of his free time will go to reading instead of to them or to anything else. He mentions all sorts of incomprehensible stuff to me about putting on pants and going to theaters and movies and whatnot. I don't get any of that, but I guess it makes him happy. But he mentions that in addition to structuring his whole life, or large chunks of his life, around finding the time to read, which I think a lot of readers who want to do more reading don't do, then in addition to that, he also makes sure, it's a time-honored how to read more tip, he makes sure that he has some form of reading to plug into any open space in any given day. If he's waiting for someone for a meal, if he's standing in line, if he's walking down the street, when it comes to audiobooks, that time is used for reading. And when you do, the more of that you do, the better able your mind gets at creating a sort of parallel card catalog indexes, so that you have, yes, that 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there, walking down the sidewalk listening to one audiobook, and it just slots in your memory, and you remember where you are. So that it's not as disjointed as it feels, or it sounds, is what I'm saying. You can get a huge amount of reading done that way. I myself spend almost no time in such situations anymore. I have pruned them almost entirely out of my life, and yet I can get whole books read. If I have a Regency romance in my shoulder bag, I can get it read just in those interstitial moments, and that is wonderful. And I thought all of that was fascinating about Eric's video, but one of the things that left me a little wondering, and that maybe when you watch it might leave you a little wondering, is the more nitty-gritty consideration of the actual question, how do you read so much? Because yes, those things are very important. A is that you have the privilege to read at all, or the privilege to read a lot. You're not forced to work 16 hours a day like your own ancestors did. And B, the publishing world helps you just a bit. It helps you to maintain your enthusiasm, and also helps you with reading stock, with the actual books. Here, hold on just a second. Stop it. Okay? Sorry, Bean was going nuts, and she still is. I don't know what it is, but my kind of rule of thumb here is that if mounting obstacles to making a video become sort of a shrieking sound in the background earlier than the 1 minute mark, I stop, address everything, and then start over. At 10 minutes, I don't, unless they become so shrieking that I say to myself, I have to stop, and at that point I don't redo, and I don't upload anything. So at that point I decide that fate does not want this particular video to be made. Fortunately, there are an endless number of other videos to be made. But what I was saying was, Eric addresses the larger questions. Yes, you have the privilege to do a lot of reading. In his case, even, and in my case, in the case of a few more booktubers, even more privilege in that the publishing industry wants your opinions. They want to send you books. And also that you structure your life around it. If this thing means that much to you, then you will structure large portions of your life around it. And if you don't do that, there's no harm in that, except that I don't want to hear you complain that you don't have time for reading. If you say, oh my God, there's nothing I'd like better than just read, and you in the next conversation say that you go out drinking and dancing with your friends all of Thursday night, all of Friday night, and all of Saturday night, and you spend all of Sunday detoxing in agony, well, then you haven't structured your life in order to. You're saying one thing on a Wednesday, but on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, you're saying something completely different. Perfectly, you're right to say so, but I'd rather you didn't say the first thing. If you're going to live your life that way, I'd rather you didn't say the first thing. Same thing with the endless number of young people I know who bemoan the fact that they don't have time to read, but somehow find the time for 6 solid hours every day of playing video games. 6 solid hours every day. There is no amount of reading you could possibly want to do that you couldn't get done with that time, and you don't allot it. So that's it. Eric didn't say it in quite this admonishing tone, but I am. It's a very good point. One of the bigger picture ways of how to read so much is to structure your life to reflect the fact of that you want to do that. But I wanted to add, for my response, some actual nitty-gritty ways to read more. And I myself read an enormous amount. An enormous amount. I read roughly 150 pages an hour. And I read for roughly an average of 10 to 11 hours every day. That's a huge amount of reading, and I'm able to do that for all of the reasons that Eric mentions in his videos. I have structured my life entirely around it. I have a steady supply of books, as you see on this channel. I have a steady supply of books from publishers. I also have access to great used bookstores here in Boston, and I have the lowercase non-hashtag kind of privilege where I'm able to do this and still make a living. But there are some other things, some more specific things that people always ask me about. And some of those things, I made a list of 6 of them. And of the list of 6, 4 aren't quite duplicatable just off the bat. 4 of them might sound like I'm needling you. And I don't mean to be. The first one is that I read very fast. That might sound like it's off the table. It's not. I didn't start that way. I read very fast because it's a muscle, and the more you work it, the better shape it gets in, so that it's not hard to do. Once you read a huge amount every day, your reading speed goes up. Usually. It's been my experience that it does. Certainly it did in my case, and it might in yours as well. Number 2 is that I do it for many hours every day. In his video, Eric mentioned that he often sleeps 6 hours in a night. And that's not counting the insomnia that I guess he sometimes suffers from. He correctly pointed out what many insomniacs have told me, which is that that's not actually extra fun time. You're not going to get anything done in the time when you just can't sleep and want to. He's talking about in the normal course of events, without suffering from insomnia, he sleeps less than an ordinary person does, and therefore gets in a little more reading time. And that is doubly and triply true for me as well. I sleep very, very little, far less than 6 hours a night. I cannot, and what I do sleep is infinitely postponable. I can postpone it for long periods of time before it catches up with me. And that is freakish. That is not normal. And it helps a lot, because at midnight, every night, I turn into a pumpkin. I turn off all social media. I turn off the outside world completely, and I just read. And sometimes, very often, I read until the sun comes up. And I am perfectly aware and very grateful. I'm very grateful with the fact that that means that essentially I get an extra reading day for every one day. So, around 11:15, 11:30, when you're starting to wind down, your reading is done for that day, and it's going to pick up again, let's say ideally at sunrise, whereas mine is just starting. I have read a huge chunk already in that day, but then I get to exclusively read for hours, and that helps. That's why Eric mentioned it. That's why I'm mentioning. And the third one is I've been doing this for a very long time. I came to reading late, but I have been making up for lost time for decades, and that helps. That helps with experience. It really does. You get to let's say Eric's bailiwick is contemporary fiction. You get to a contemporary novel. He's too nice to say this, at least on his BookTube channel, but you get to a contemporary novel, you find, a single mother, 2 children, rough times, the return of a violent husband. There's a significant percentage of that kind of book that you can kind of read on autopilot if it's average or poorly done. If it's brilliantly done, then you'll feel that electric tingle that I always talk about, and it is the holy grail of all of us who read anything. You'll feel that electric surge, and you will put away autopilot completely, and you'll pay close attention to what you're reading. But a lot of times that isn't the case, especially in genre fiction, but also in contemporary fiction and even in nonfiction. If I'm reading a new biography of Charlemagne, and I get the impression after 14 or 15 pages or even 3 or 4 chapters that this author is going to coast from time to time, I can coast with him. My review of it will reflect that fact, but nevertheless, it speeds up. That kind of experience can speed up the reading procedure a lot. Not that you're skipping anything, but that, if something is expected by you, you will read it faster. And then the fourth thing that I don't know, it's not going to seem completely transferable right immediately, is that I was also trained to do this. Not reading so much as critical thinking. I was trained by the Jesuits and to use concentration as a kind of a very pointed precision instrument. And that kind of training never goes away. Spend some time with a Jesuit if you don't believe me. You'll be able to pick them out of a crowd. All you have to do is hear 2 sentences and you'll be able to pick them out of a crowd. Those 4 things take some time and maybe a little happy circumstance. And then there are 2 things that I want to recommend for reading more that you can start today to do. And the first one is tricky. I've mentioned a few times on this channel, and that is not to subvocalize. Subvocalizing will cut your reading speed by 1/3 or more. Might cut it in half. And by subvocalizing, I mean where even though you're not reading out loud, you are sounding out the words in your head. You're sounding out the words in your reading imagination as you read them, which is, if you do it, always going to chain you to only how fast you can read a book out loud, which is considerably slower than how fast you read without. You do not need to subvocalize in order to read. It's just a bad habit. That's all. You don't need to do it. I myself believe that audiobooks reinforce that bad habit. That's why I don't really advocate them, because most people that I know would like to read more than they do. And audiobooks reinforce the idea that the written word is the spoken word, and that's not true. You can bypass the part of your brain, which is a completely different part from the part that you read with. You can bypass the speaking part completely. You do it all the time, right? When you're on a sidewalk and you see a sign that says walk or don't walk, you're not subvocalizing that. You're seeing it with your eyes and immediately reading it with your mind. Same thing with, like, for instance, boilerplate on a tax form or a business letter or something like that. You're not doing it that way. You're not reading it that way. You could stop. It takes a little bit of effort, especially if you've been doing it for your whole life, but you can stop. And when you do, your reading speed will hurtle forward in terms of pages per hour. Those of you who've tried it will see what I mean. It's a little unnerving. It takes a little bit of effort to stop doing it if you made a lifetime of doing it, but I highly recommend it. It isn't necessary, so why bother? If you're reading it out loud to someone, that's a different story. But if you're not, if you're just reading it for pleasure, why sound it out at all? Your voice, your mouth doesn't need to be involved in that procedure. So the practical tip I would have for reading more, number one, would be that. Don't subvocalize. Find out whether or not you do it, and if you do it, stop doing it. And the last one, the second of these transferable things, and the sixth of the tips that I have for reading more, is to concentrate on what you're doing, which might sound like it's self-evident, but nevertheless, most readers that I know don't do it. They have their phone on. the whole time. They're checking their phone the whole time. Well, they have the TV on, and they're checking the TV the whole time. Or they've intentionally put themselves in a position that is raucously full of distractions. People, conversation, traffic, whatever it is. And they know that they're not going to be able to concentrate past those things, and they do it anyway. One of the ways that you will read more is to concentrate exclusively on what you're doing. That's why, as much as I understand that some of you have a kind of a ritual that you've built up around reading that involves just the right tea at just the right temperature and just the right throw cushion and just the right plate of snacks with just the right distance from your hand, that sort of thing, or just the right music. Much as I understand that ritual, and if that ritual brings you pleasure, fine, great, then keep doing it. But again, I don't want to hear that you don't have enough time to read if you indulge in that sort of stuff, because that sort of stuff slows you down. All of it, of course, is a distraction from reading. If you're going to be reading, you should concentrate just on reading, and you should structure your reading world around that to help you with that. Having snacks or drink or whatever. I know one young person who says that when I have a novel that I really want to get through, there's nothing better than having wafers that I dip in milk. How much effort does it take to coordinate in your mind thinking about the timing, the placement, the mess, the action of dipping wafers in milk and eating them while you're reading, making sure not to dribble sugary milk on your page? It's an enormous distraction. And so is a lot of other stuff that dedicated readers I know still do. So, and that's fine if you like doing that. But if your goal is to read more, the implied goal of a question like, how do you read so much, is how can I read more? Okay, if that's your goal, then what you need to do is encourage that goal instead of not doing anything to encourage it and still thinking that it will somehow happen. It won't. And you don't think that way in any other aspect of your life. Do you? No. If you say, I want to take up watercolor, you don't pick up the nearest colored pen and start drawing on random paper. No, you orchestrate that activity. You orchestrate your surroundings in order to help with that activity. Reading should be the same way. If that's what your goal, if you want to read more, then, you know, Eric's video was a kind of a friendly version of what I'm saying, and my version is a little more admonishing, and that is, if you want this, you have to do a certain amount of structuring of your life in order to encourage it. You can't expect it to happen if you don't. Of course, Eric didn't include in his video the browbeating doom saying that I always include on mine when I come on this subject. So I thought I would end with a little bit of browbeating doom saying, which is that the universe is billions of years old. And for millions and millions and millions of years, billions of years, on this planet, the only life was microscopic. It was scum. It was a planet of scum forever and ever. And through random chance and wild extrapolations of luck, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years later, we have humans. And again, through a massive concatenation of lucky events, you are one of them now, living a life of privilege that allows you to spend chunks of time reading. If that's your goal, then you ought to remember one crucial fact about the end result of all of that luck, which is that in about 10 minutes, you're going to be dead. And it's going to feel, right before it happens, just that fast. If you don't believe me, then go to the nearest old person. In the case for a lot of you, it'll be those battered, emptied husks of beings that are your parents. Go to them and ask them how long it feels to them since they were 18. I'd be willing to bet that in all cases, their answer will be, I don't know where the time went. It happened overnight. You're going to feel the same way. You have no time at all. None whatsoever. So this business of reading slumps, or I'll get to it next year, oh my God. No, this is urgent. This is the one and only time that the chemicals that comprise this universe will come together to make you. And once your chemicals dissipate, in about 10 minutes, they'll never recombine. This is it. This is your one and only chance. You are a spark struck from an anvil, flying into the dark, and in a second, you're going to land on the ground and fizzle out. So if you want to read more, a sense of urgency might work well. But anyway, now that I've ruined your day, I'm going to wrap this up. But I've got plenty more to talk about, so we'll reconvene soon. Thank you, Book 2.